So let's look at the New Zealand market. Because this is recorded and people are going to watch it later, I just want to record that this is mid-May 2022. And right now, I would observe these things, which I jotted down this afternoon. The Auckland market is flatlining. In fact, there's all sorts of noises about South Auckland and West Auckland houses having no one turn up to open homes, no one turn up to auctions, and stuff that is selling is increasingly discounted on the 2021 price. So we're definitely in the downturn, and there is some distress starting to show. People with finicky assets, like development assets with a rundown house on big land, or leaky houses that need to be reclad, or all that stuff that has been moving in the last few years, it's not moving. It's starting to sit. And that is because everybody knows the market's peaked and all these other factors. So we're seeing declining values in Auckland, and it's patchy across the rest of the country. Obviously, Auckland is very flat. I think it's getting the worst of it. But there are other parts of the country that are starting to slow up. Yet I've heard that Queenstown is quite hot. Christchurch is actually quite buoyant at the moment. Rotorua is down a bit, so it's patchy. But the state of the market in New Zealand is definitely not at a state where you'd say, oh goodness, the good times are rolling. We're heading into a recessionary environment. And that, of course, is interest rates are rising rapidly with the advent of inflation. We've got triple CFA and tight credit. So the bank's not lending to the same LVRs. In fact, they're pulling the purse strings back. So we've had 2 years of COVID immigration, which has been at zero. And that's demand, isn't it? So if you know people coming into the country, I think 2020, March 2020, we had 83,000 people come into the country. So if you divide by roughly 3 people per house, 28,000 people, 28,000 houses were required to house those 83,000 people coming into the country. We haven't had any immigration for 2 years. In fact, everybody that was living here went home. And the ones that wanted to come in because of MIQ couldn't come in. So we've just had static population or declining population, which is negative demand for property. Big picture, we've got a lack of labour market availability for all sectors, recession, a lot of feeling that a recession is looming, not just in New Zealand, but globally. Talk of stagflation, which is dropping asset values, and rising inflation, which is terrible. We haven't seen that since the 80s. Talk of oversupply of small houses because of the Auckland Unitary Plan delivering small houses. And anybody living in Auckland knows how many are being built. They're just everywhere. And many of them are nasty and horrible. And I think that sort of stuff is just going to crash in value because they've made too many of them. And with immigration being at zero, I just can't see the demand until we have a government that wants to let migrants back in. Next year is an election year, 2023. That always creates huge uncertainty. We have war in Europe on the horizon. Certainly Ukraine's getting a terrible hammering at the moment. That's creating oil shocks and supply chain shocks. Fertilizer, which is going to affect food supply. That's creating all sorts of concerns globally, and rampant inflation, and not to mention the massive number of tax changes that are really affecting property in New Zealand because of the complexity, particularly reduction of the ability to deduct interest, which is coming in. It's going to make a bunch of people insolvent because they're paying tax on the net yield and they can't deduct the interest. So if they can't deduct the interest, they pay tax on the net yield and they don't deduct the interest. That's going to make people insolvent. So that, people, is bad news. Who in their right mind would want to be a property developer with all that going on? You'd have to ask yourself. And the answer is, well, I would like to be a property developer in that environment, because out of that environment, if you play the long game, you'll be able to pick up fantastic assets. You don't have to build them in this environment, but you can certainly get really good development opportunities because everyone's running away from property in the next 12 months. We might pick. It's going to get harder and harder and harder to sell, which makes it a buyer's market. And if you're playing the 10-year game, you're going to be able to get assets that in 10 years are going to be very valuable and excellent development properties. So let's talk about the cycles. I'm sure you're aware that property is cyclical, and in the New Zealand context, it's a 10-year cycle that has historically boomed on the 7-year. So we had the peaks in 87, 97, 2007, 2017. Something changed though in the last 3 years. The next boom should have been 2027, but we had a boom in 2021. What caused that? You know, we only went down for about 6 to 8 months, and then suddenly COVID hit, and instead of what the economists said would happen, which was absurd, they all said house prices were going to crash, they went the roof. The property values went through the roof. What the economists didn't understand was when you drop interest rates to 2% and increase LVRs to 80%, New Zealand will speculate in the housing market, and that's exactly what happened. So house prices got pumped up by cheap money and loose credit conditions, which is an indictment on the Reserve Bank for allowing it to happen, and that's what happened. We had an early boom. So we've had a double boom, no bust, and I read that as serious risk. Normally, you get a boom, you have a downturn, even a bit of a bust, and you get a flattening for at least 7 to 8 years, and then you get a 2-year boom at the other end, maybe a 3-year boom. But that 7 or 8 years allows incomes to catch up to rents and asset values. But if you get a boom, no discernible downturn, and then another boom, you got a double boom, I think we could see a double bust. So one of the things I want to give to you out of this is be careful. We're top of the cycle, and we're going into the downturn, and it could be a hard landing. I don't care what the economists say, it could be a very hard landing. This, and you know, I put my money where my mouth is, right? I'm a long-term developer. I've got 50 plus houses in my portfolio as a buy and hold investor, and a lot of JVs on that. But, you know, I'm in this game, and it's my job and my group to read the market, see where things are going. And I think we're going to see a hard landing this cycle. So be careful. But having said that, in that hard landing is massive opportunity to work the down market. Okay, now Auckland stops first, and South Auckland and West Auckland have stopped first quarter this year, second quarter this year. I did read at an auction this morning or today that Ray White and Manukau had 13 out of 17 auction sales, which is a bit of revival. But geez, the last 2 months have been terrible in South Auckland and West Auckland, and I just see that continuing for the rest of the year. Another thing to think about is that cycles can actually be broken by a government. So the 10-year, 7-year thing, it's broken because this government pumped cheap money into the market, and we've got a double boom. So lots of people say, oh, every 10 years is going to be a boom. Well, I think we got the 2027 boom in 2021, and it's going to take a long time for incomes to catch up to the value that assets got pumped up to. Either that or the asset values will crash down. Once you accept that the market is looking pear-shaped, you can say, well, okay, not everywhere, because not everywhere got pumped as hard as Auckland did. And you can see that actually some other areas are actually relatively cheap, especially to Auckland, and therefore through ripple effect, affordability, people will go to those areas because it's cheaper to live there. And if you add to that other factors in the market, like these medium density residential standards which are coming through, if you join the dots there are parts of New Zealand that are being rezoned high density that are going to benefit from that, you know, ability to build blocks of units like Auckland did, which is going to push up asset values for the assets that are better for that sort of development. And it's already cheap there, so there's more room for upside. So, you know, cycles in the market, just because Auckland's down doesn't mean the rest of the country's necessarily going to have a hard landing. I think Auckland's going to get the worst of it. And there are parts of New Zealand that represent value. Rotorua is pretty cheap, and it's been brought in as one of the tier 1 cities that is going to, it's a town, but it's going to get early rezoning because it's so stressed and short of appropriately loaned sand appropriately zoned land for high density. So, there's an example of an area that I think is going to flourish because of the zoning changes going on there. Christchurch is the same. So you can work this stuff out, invest ahead of the curve and take advantages of information that the rest of the market doesn't necessarily understand. So these Resource Management Act changes with medium density residential standards, these changes that are coming, are going to be a big part of what you need to focus on. So here's a graph. 2017 was the last boom. Next boom should be 2027, but we got it in 2021, only 4 years later. We got it too soon. So I think the next peak will be much further out. Either we get a big crash at the back of it because things just got pushed too high, or more likely the market will be flatter for longer rather than a big crash, which is politically unpopular, recessionary. Maybe there's some political appetite to crash property values because it's good for first-time buyers and so forth, and this government doesn't like property oligarchs, as they call us. But, it doesn't make sense to let the market crash too hard because it becomes very recessionary and that's bad for employment and so forth. So I would say the government won't try and drive it to the bottom. They'll just try and get the heat out of it and get it down 5% or something like that. That would be a sensible thing to do. And if that happens, you'll see, because you've had a double boom, you'll see a protracted period of flattening before the income as a percentage of the asset value will start to make sense. And it's not until that happens that you can see future growth. So I think next peak's a long way away, and you're going to have to do the hard work to make money out of property. Last 20 years, it's been easy because asset values just, very predictably gone up, flatlined, gone up, flatlined. Well, actually, that cycle's going to change. There's one more thing over the top of this you should think about. If you look 30 years back, interest rates were all in the teens, and over the last 30 years, they've gone from, 15, 18% our parents were paying back in the day in the late 70s, early 90s, early 80s. They've gone from the late teens to zero, practically, 2% is free, money's free. So that reduction of 16%, if you like, in the interest rate has funded a lot of the growth in property. Well, that trend is gone. That's a long-term trend and it's gone. So now for the cash flow of property to make sense, you're going to have to see either incomes come up or the asset value crash down. So that's why I'm saying to you, 2021 sort of sucked the last bit of cash flow out of the market because we saw interest rates push right down. Now interest rates are coming back up, it's a long time till we get another drink, I think. Okay, so off the back of that, if you like, critique of property that says New Zealand is, structurally changed, its income ratios don't make sense, doesn't mean to say you can't make money out of property, because guess what? In property, there's just demand for home ownership coming from immigration. So once we see immigration firing back up, you'll see demand for houses for people to live in. Even if they're unaffordable, those migrants are quite rich. When you come down to specific assets that you develop in your portfolio, there are lots of advantages in this market. 5-year Brightline tax applies. Okay, so if you develop to hold, if you buy a property and develop it to hold it, you get a 5-year Brightline rule. And if you buy a new build off someone else, you get a 5-year Brightline rule. You are also exempt interest on deduction rules, giving it a massive tax advantage for 20 years. So develop to hold, you've got 2 big tax advantages there. You have much better bank support for new builds. The banks are incentivising new builds with 80% loan to value ratios. And there are cheaper interest rates around from some of the banks for new builds. When you buy a investment property of someone else, you don't necessarily make any money when you buy. You can add value to it and extract value by doing it that way. Buy, reno, revalue and get a step up on that. But with development margin, in the same breath, in the same vein, you can buy a property, build on it, create a development margin, and that margin not only makes you money, but it keeps you safe. Because let's say you've got a 25% margin on your development, say a $500,000 margin on a $2 million development. Let's say you develop to hold and the market falls 25%. Okay, so you've got a 25% margin, which is 500,000, and the end value is 2 million, so it costs you 1.5. And the market falls a whopping 25%, which would be shocking. How much money did you lose? Well, you lost your margin. You didn't lose any of your capital. So adding value through development when you buy actually insulates you from risk. So people look at development as risky. Actually, you don't look at it like that. It's insulating you from risk because you're creating a buffer. You lose your margin, not your capital, as long as you've got the finance to get through. You can build assets that are suitable for investment property. So one of my projects is in Claiborne Road, which we're going to look at. It's a block of 12 units. Matt's actually doing the design for me. And part of that is where it's going into social housing. And so I want the thing built robustly so that my social housing tenants can't destroy the property. So we're using a block base, for example, because it's hard to dent blocks. And for level 2 and 3, we're going to use tough line chip. So you can build it fit for purpose, and buying other people's properties, you don't necessarily get that. Land banking is an excellent thing to do with developments, where you just buy the land and sit on it, knowing that the potential's there and you get huge value. I'm teaching about that tonight. And you can also trade, so you can get income or take a long-term capital gain. The trading's taxable if you develop to sell. The land banking is non-taxable if you just hold it for long-term investment. The assumption is the market's going to crash, and therefore it's very, very risky, and you're going to lose all your money if you're not careful. That is what your bankers are going to tell you, your financial advisors, your lawyers, your accountants, because they look at property as if it's something you have to do. Well, with development, timing is in your controls. You might acquire the land cheap in the crash, knowing that you've got a good site with all of the factors that we like to have on a site. You can do the consenting when the market's a bit quieter because it's cheaper and quicker. All of the supply chain of consultants will be able to help you at lower cost. And then you might just sit on that consent and wait till the builders aren't quite so busy, and wait till everything's on sale, and then start your construction. And also you'll time that with when you think the market's nearing the end of the recession. So you might buy something now, consent it in 2 years' time, and build it in 5 years' time. So it's, we're playing the long game here. We're not just thinking short term. And when you start to play the long game and look ahead, and you see it as a cycle, and you see it as a long-term habit, you're always doing this, and you're stacking sites for development later, and you land bank them for now, but develop them when they make sense, then that bigger picture can make you an awful lot of money. So the money is actually made in the down market when everybody's telling you don't do it. That's actually precisely the time to be doing it, but you just have to, stage it out, spread it out over time. You buy in the down market and you get paid in the boom market.